Hello, everyone. Today, we want to look at the hypothalamus and the control of body weight. And one of the interesting things that we're going to see in this session is that the control of body weight is actually under homeostatic regulation within the body. You may remember from very early in your studies, a key part or a key function of the body is homeostasis. That is, the ability to keep vital parameters within a narrow range. So you think about parameters like temperature or parameters about like the amount of body water. The body is constantly working to keep these parameters, keep these vital measurements within a particular range so that your body keeps functioning well. Within that context, it's a bit surprising to learn that body weight is also one of the parameters that the brain and other systems in the body functions to keep under homeostatic control. Now, the key structure within the brain responsible for all of this homeostatic control is a very small part of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus lies, as the name suggests, just below the thalamus, and it only weighs approximately 3.5 to 4 grams, or 1% of total brain weight. However, the hypothalamus, through its various nuclei, has a massive effect on body function, and really perhaps influences more areas of bodily function than any other part of the brain, if you just think of it as one particular small region of the brain. From an anatomical point of view, it's divided into 3 regions: anterior, middle, and posterior. But perhaps more importantly are the numerous nuclei that are located within the hypothalamus and that all seem to have different functions and affect different aspects of behavior. You can see many of these nuclei located on the image on your screen right now. Now, because of this vast range of functions, and also because original studies showed that activation of the hypothalamus would activate the autonomic nervous system, the hypothalamus was originally called the head ganglia. More recent work has raised or brought into some level of controversy the exact role of these nuclei, because it has been suggested that maybe the origin for these effects in the hypothalamus might not all lie in these nuclei, but might actually be the result of fiber tracts running through the hypothalamus and not originating in the hypothalamus. However, that's an area that's still up for debate and still needs investigation. What we do know is that the hypothalamus is able to exert this vast array of effects because of its numerous connections to other brain structures and to the rest of the body. There are 3 broad areas of connections that the hypothalamus has. The first is that it projects backward and downward through the brain stem onto the spinal cord and by extension onto visceral centers in the body by activating the autonomic nervous system. And so we can see that the hypothalamus does function like a head ganglia of the autonomic nervous system and does cause widespread stimulation of the autonomic nervous system. We also know that the hypothalamus connects upwards into many other areas of the midbrain and the cortex via the thalamus and the limbic system, and therefore is able to influence both limbic functions and wider, higher center functions. And then finally, we know very well, and this has perhaps been best studied, the fact that the hypothalamus is part of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is one example of a strong connection that the hypothalamus has to the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus links to both the posterior and anterior pituitary by a group of neurons called the hypothalamic infundibulum. And via this connection and via bloodstream connections is able to affect a vast array of endocrine functions in the body. So again, taken collectively, the hypothalamus has a massive effect on functioning of the human body. So let's summarize these functions. The first, as we've mentioned, is homeostatic regulation. Some of these would include temperature, some includes body water, but we also shall see today that it also includes feeding and body weight. The second, just to remind you, it is a major center for regulating autonomic control, and therefore regulates things like blood pressure, GIT motility, respiratory rate, and all the other features of bodily function under autonomic control. Within the hypothalamus, we also find the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and also via other connections, we know that the hypothalamus is important in regulating circadian rhythms and the sleep-wake cycle. We know the hypothalamus is linked into the natural reward pathways of the brain that are important for creating a sense of pleasure and influencing motivations and drives. Linked to that, of course, is the hypothalamus is a component of the limbic system, and therefore also influences emotional responses, which is linked to motivation and drive. And finally, as I just mentioned, via the connections to the anterior and posterior pituitary, it affects directly oxytocin and vasopressin release, and also indirectly several other hormonal systems in the body to be the major center for the regulation of endocrine function. You would probably look at all of these other different functions in other lectures and other parts of your courses. I want to focus now on the control of body weight. Now, like I said previously, this is under homeostatic control, which means it's operating via a negative feedback system. But if I were to ask you that, most of us would not be aware of that, in the same way we're aware that temperature is under homeostatic control. So let's just note that what we're about to talk about is very, very important within the context of public health and global health in general. Over the past 40 years, there's been a significant increase in obesity. Human beings are getting larger. This increase has been so significant that the term globesity has been coined to describe this epidemic of obesity. And beyond the fact that we're getting larger, this epidemic of obesity is affecting our health because it leads to downstream health consequences, including diabetes, including hypertension, including increased rates of cancer, strokes, depression, and many other disorders. It has been estimated that obesity can affect global GDP by almost 3% or $2 trillion US. So when we think about the control of body weight, what are we really focusing on? Well, like I said, we now believe that body weight is under homeostatic control. And that means there is a set point for what our weight should be. That all of us as individuals have a set point for weight, or fat mass might be more accurate. In the same way, we have a set point for our body temperature. Well, what's the evidence for this? Because we can't just be making these statements without evidence. Well, one piece of evidence is most humans tend to maintain their body weight over years. Once they've reached their adult body weight, you tend to see that that body weight is fairly constant, despite in many cases attempts to increase it or decrease it. But from more evidence-based approaches, there have been actual experiments in which animals have been put through a series of feeding regimes. And it has shown that these feeding regimes, once removed, the animals actually return to their original body weight. Let's just look at a graph that explains this in a little bit more detail. So here we have an experiment that's taken place, and we're going to have 3 groups of rats. The first group, B, is going to serve as a control group, and they are being fed a normal chow or a normal diet. And you can see as they're fed that diet over a period of a little over 2 months, there's a steady increase in body weight. The second group, Group A, they're going to undergo a period of about 15 to 20 days between these 2 markers, 1 and 2, when they are given extra food. They are forced to eat extra food. And then that's stopped. And the third group is going to go on a restricted diet for the same period of time. So there you have it. You have 3 groups of animals. One is allowed to feed normally. One is given extra food for a period of time. And another group is given less food for a period of time. And you can see the group that got extra food, they put on weight as expected. And the group that got less food, they lost weight as expected when compared to the control group. However, once the animals all returned to the normal diet, notice the group that was fed less, their trajectory returned to the original. And so did the group that was fed more. They didn't stay overweight or they didn't stay underweight. And this shows us that there seems to be some inherent biology, that now the group that was fed less seemed to be changing their diet or something that was causing them to increase weight. And the group that was fed more, similarly, something was going on that was causing them to lose weight. And this is part of why we feel there's a negative feedback system and there's a set point for body weight. Now, many years ago, a scientist was actually looking at the size of different animals. And he came to the conclusion, based on different studies that he did, that there was a link between the size of animals and their metabolic rate. And he basically came up with something called Cleavers Equation, which said that the amount of calories burned a day was 70 times your weight to the power 0.75. And the important thing I want you to get here is the fact that your metabolic rate was actually linked to your body size. And this seems to be one of the ways in which our bodies adapt to changes in fat mass. When we increase in size, it seems that the body will then slow down its metabolic rate in order to bring you back to the set point. And when you decrease in size, it seems that the body will increase its metabolic rate to return you to the set point. And therefore, one of the ways in which we can regulate body size is by changing our metabolic rate. How many calories, how much energy are we expending on a regular and a daily basis? So then, how does your brain control your weight? The set point theory says that your body weight stays within a certain range. And in order to balance and maintain balance, if you lose weight, as in starvation, 2 things are going to happen. You're going to have an increase in hunger designed to make you eat more, and your basal metabolic rate is going to decrease. If, on the other hand, you eat too much, then what's going to happen? Well, you're going to feel more full, designed to make you eat less, and your basal metabolic rate is going to increase. And the result is you should return to your set point. And this has been suggested for why diets do not seem to work, because these short-term changes don't change your set point, and your body quickly soon starts to work counter to your diet by adjusting your metabolism. So let's think about the set point now for weight and compare it to that for temperature. Well, what we see then is that unlike temperature, where everybody has the same set point, when we're talking about body weight, individuals have different set points. So that's the most important thing, that the set point for you and I is actually different. What are some of the things that we now know seem to affect this set point? Well, primarily it seems to be affected by genetic factors. But then other things can act upon those genetic factors to also influence the set point. Things like the types of food that are consumed, especially the highly palatable Western diet with its focus on processed foods. Stress, exercise, and also the gut microbiome are all now known to influence set point. Unfortunately, this is an area that we still don't fully understand. One thing we do realize, though, is that for some reason, part of the obesity crisis is the fact that the set point for many individuals is being elevated, leading to obesity. But how to bring it back down is still under great investigation. Let me give you an example of this from real life. Some of you may have watched a television program that used to be on the channel in the United States, NBC, approximately 10 years ago. It was called The Biggest Loser. And persons who were obese would come and spend about 3 months or a certain period of time on the show, in which they would be exposed to very intense exercise and also low-calorie diets. And the show was entertainment. It was designed to see who would be the biggest loser, who could lose the most weight. Now, a study was done on one particular season. And as you can see, this was season 8. And everybody lost weight. Everybody successfully lost weight. The winner was a gentleman called Danny Cahill, who lost 239 pounds. These participants were then reviewed 6 years later. And unfortunately, for many of them, they regained their weight, though some of them did keep it off for a lot of them. Danny also regained weight, but he still seems to have the least, or has is the smallest in weight at this point. So this immediately tells you that something was going on. Interestingly, when you observe their metabolism, what you notice is during the strict period of the program, their basal metabolic rate for all of them decreased. So Danny, as you can see, his basal metabolic rate, it decreased, and so did all of the other participants. In other words, as they lost weight and they got smaller, their body was fighting against further loss of weight by reducing how many calories they were expending every day. And for all of the participants, that trend seemed to continue after they left the program. So much so that Danny, 6 years later, was burning 800 calories less when compared to a man of his same weight. Let me explain that to you. Let's say at this point, Danny weighs 300 pounds, and he should be burning 25 kilocalories, 2,500 calories a day in order just to maintain his weight. Well, that's what the average 300-pound man would burn. Danny was actually burning 1,700. And if he ate more than that, he would tend to put on weight. So here we see that example of the set point theory and its relation to basal metabolic rate. We're not too sure exactly what's going on there, but one of the things that has been suggested is these extreme diets affect muscle mass, and muscle mass is absolutely critical to helping to maintain our basal metabolic rate. And if we don't build back that muscle mass, it might not allow us to increase BMR and therefore affect body mass. So the question that we now have to ask, and that's being asked in the last decade, is obesity, this epidemic of obesity, really because people don't have self-control and self-discipline and they're just eating too much? Or is it that something is going wrong within the physiology of these people as they're exposed to the abnormal environment of the westernized diet. In other words, the westernized diet presents a unique problem for the human body. And the human body was not designed to be constantly receiving a stream of highly palatable, high sugar, high salt, high fat input. And beyond it tasting good, does it somehow interfere with our physiology and shift our set point? Let me just play a little video that's talking about this from a research program that was done for television.
Let me introduce you to Amanda. You're just meeting her for the first time, but chances are you're already making assumptions about how much she eats and how little she exercises because she's obese. But I'm about to show you that there's much more than meets the eye when it comes to obesity. There are lots of Amandas out there and they need treatment. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe you know an Amanda. It's time to act on obesity. But in order to do so effectively, we need to understand obesity. It's generally accepted that body weight is determined by a pretty simple formula. We call it the energy balance equation, and it works like this. If the number of calories that you consume equals the number of calories that you burn, your weight remains the same. If you consume more than you burn, you gain weight. And if you burn more than you consume, you lose weight. Most people think that those of us who properly manage our energy balance remain lean, whereas those of us, like Amanda, who eat too much and exercise too little, become obese. We view obesity as a lifestyle choice, and the cure for it is simple: eat less and exercise more. This may sound logical, but it's wrong. Let me explain. First, let's talk about set point. No, I'm not talking about the point in a tennis match when one player is about to beat the other. I'm talking about a theory that says that no matter what you consciously want your weight to be, your brain has its own sense of how much body fat it should have on board, and it has a complex system in place that very precisely regulates your energy intake and expenditure to keep you within a so-called set point range for body fat. So that whole energy balance equation, it's not something that you control voluntarily. Your brain regulates your calories in to your calories out for you. For your brain to do this, it needs to know how much energy you have on board at all times. And it knows this by listening to hormones like leptin, which is made in your body fat. You can think of it like a car. Leptin is the gas gauge that tells your brain how much gas is in your tank. But leptin is just one piece of the puzzle. You've got a whole bunch of other hormonal signals and sensors that are involved too. Your bones, muscles, pancreas, liver, GI tract and sensory organs, they all play a role, communicating with your brain to give it the information it needs to do its job. But that's more detail than we need for this conversation. The point is that you have a complex system in place that regulates you to within a set point range for body fat. So what happens if Amanda decides to lose weight by going on a diet? After all, people with obesity should eat less, right? Here's what happens. She loses weight, but her hormone levels change. Her brain hears this, and it starts acting to restore whatever body fat she's lost. She feels hungrier, and although she doesn't know it, she's also burning fewer calories than before. You see, set point is usually a one-way street. Once it's been elevated, the brain works to defend it, just as vigorously as it would a lower set point. Amanda's brain doesn't know that she needs to lose weight. It only knows to defend her current set point. Back to our car analogy. Amanda can't help but look for a gas station to refuel when she sees that her gas gauge is low. At the same time, she becomes more fuel efficient, burning less energy than before. This might explain why treating obesity with diet and exercise so often fails to produce the desired results. It's sort of like telling Amanda that she needs to be a more careful driver, when the real problem is that she needs a mechanic to fix her car. Okay, so if we've all got this complicated system in place that prevents us from losing weight, why doesn't it also protect us from gaining weight and developing obesity in the first place? How can we explain the obesity epidemic? Getting back to Amanda, why did she develop obesity? The answer is that it takes a perfect storm to cause an obesity epidemic like the one we're seeing now, and it's our modern environment that places us, and Amanda, directly in the path of that storm. While there's no single cause for the rising rate of obesity, changes to the chemical and nutrient content of our food, the so-called Western diet, a decrease in physical activity, increased levels of stress, inadequate and disrupted sleep, and more widespread use of medications that promote weight gain all play a role. Our unique genetics and developmental histories cause each of us to respond differently to these elements of the modern environment, and some of us, like Amanda, respond by sending hormonal signals that elevate our set point for body fat. It's not that Amanda's system has stopped working, it's just that it's working to regulate her to a set point that's too high. So you can think of obesity as a biological response to the modern environment, a disease where the body dysregulates to a body fat set point that is too high. Back to our car analogy. The size of Amanda's gas tank has expanded, so she carries around too much fuel. It's time to stop blaming Amanda for her obesity. It's time to recognize that obesity is a disease, not a lifestyle choice, and those who suffer from it deserve treatment, not snap judgment. It's time to act on obesity, and now that you've been educated, here's a simple way for you to act. Share this video.
So that was quite a comprehensive review of the complexity involved in regulating body weight. Let's just look at another video that's a little shorter, just emphasizing this point.
There's no doubt about it.
We're getting larger.
And larger. So why are we doing so much damage to ourselves, our health services, and our planet?
How do you begin to make sense of overeating and obesity?
Is it mainly nurture, the environment?
Or is it more to do with nature, our biology?
That's what we're looking at here. Food's not just confined to the food shops these days. It's everywhere, looking at you. But it's not just that there's more food around. A lot of it is very different food. It's been significantly altered from its natural state, usually with added salt, fat, chemicals, and lots of refined sugar. But we can't explain the dramatic rise in weight gain just by looking at what we eat and drink. Because we aren't just piling more calories in, we're also using up a lot less.
We don't even have to get up off the sofa to change the channel on the television or to pick up the phone. I mean, as a child, I can remember running up and down the stairs, trying to answer the phone if I thought it was a friend calling after school or what have you.
Dr. Llewellyn is part of the Gemini Project, a longitudinal study of 2,400 sets of twins, comparing their responsiveness to food in early life and their subsequent physical development.
And what we see typically are correlations of about 0.8 for the identical twins and about 0.4, 0.5 for the non-identical twins.
But if our genes are influencing our appetites and therefore our relationship with food, how are they doing this? What's going on inside us? I went to talk to a leading geneticist at the University of Cambridge to find out. So what does the genetics of obesity involve?
Quite early on, I found out that being a geneticist that studies obesity really means a geneticist that studies food intake. And so therefore, trying to understand the mechanisms of how the brain controls food intake.
Researchers at University College London estimated that people carrying 2 copies of a particular AA variant of the FTO gene were 70% more likely to become obese. Their experimental research found that participants with the FTO variant gene not only had higher levels of the hunger hormone Ghrelin in their blood, but also their brains responded differently to images of food than that of the control group.
We started out by asking whether obesity can be explained more by nature or nurture. But maybe that was the wrong question.
Because it seems rather than offering rival explanations to the same question, nature and nurture approaches are in fact addressing different questions.
I think a lot of the confusion has come historically from the fact that environmentalists are interested in the mean, so the mean weight change at a population level over time, and what have been the environmental drivers of that. But genetic researchers have never been interested in the mean. They've only ever really been interested in individual differences.
And that's just, it's actually a promo for a documentary, but it does again highlight all of the different factors that are at play when we're thinking about the regulation of body weight. So we now know then that obesity isn't as simple as we thought. Let's now actually look at some of the areas of the brain, and particularly the hypothalamus, that we do know seem to play a role in regulating our body weight. Now, early on, they were discovered two particular regions of the hypothalamus, the lateral hypothalamus and the ventromedial hypothalamus, that affected feeding behavior. The lateral hypothalamus stimulation in this region, this leads to feeding, whereas stimulation of the ventromedial hypothalamus, this leads to a sense of feeling full or not being hungry, or the term satiety. So this means if I put a lesion in the lateral hypothalamus, they will not get the cues to feed, and the end result is an animal will not eat and can possibly die. Similarly, if I were to lesion the ventromedial hypothalamus, I won't get the cues, the signals, the hormonal signals that tell me I'm feeling full, and therefore an animal will keep eating and get obese. And this is what several studies have now shown. As you can see here, if you lesion the lateral hypothalamus, there's no prompt to eat and the animal loses weight. And if you lesion the ventromedial hypothalamus, then the animal will have no signals for feeling full and get large. And this is an actual picture of animals. These studies were done 50, 60 years ago. And here you can see an animal with a ventromedial lesion, and you can see how much bigger it is than the control animal. And the weight seems to have actually gone all the way around on this scale. However, that dual center model is actually now known to be a little too simple, because we've now seen that for an animal that has a ventromedial lesion and gets obese, if that animal is then forced to lose weight by having reduced intake or given extra food, it still protects that body weight. And the end result is, beyond simply making it obese, somehow it seems to have changed the set point. And similarly, the LH lesion rat, the lateral hypothalamus lesion rat, they are also defending their new weight, and they've stabilized at a lower weight. So this again gives rise to the idea that somehow the set point theory is at work here. But what exactly is going on when we lesion these areas and how it affects the set point, we're not sure about. So these hypothalamic regions, they seem to be important for short-term satiety signals. But we do know that there are longer-term satiety signals that come as a result of the amount of fat in our body. And key to that has been the discovery of a hormone called leptin. Now, leptin is a polypeptide hormone that is primarily secreted by adipose cells. As you know, adipose tissue and the fat cells within adipose tissue, when they form fat mass. And these cells, it seems, secrete leptin, which then acts in a negative feedback mechanism to reduce eating and to increase basal metabolic rate. And so this seems to be a pretty straightforward negative feedback system. If you eat too much, the result is that extra calories taken in are stored as fat and adipose tissue. When the amount of fat increases, the leptin levels rise, and that leptin signal then acts in the hypothalamus to decrease food intake and to increase energy expenditure. And it seems that the effect on food intake is greater than the effect on energy expenditure. In like manner, the opposite will happen if you lose weight. There'll be a decrease in leptin levels. And now, instead of decreasing food intake, there'll be an increase in food intake to return body weight to within its normal range based on your individual set point. This has been supported by many studies, in particular knockout studies in which the gene that produces leptin is removed from an animal. The end result is that animal then becomes obese because that signaling to stop eating never gets to the brain, and the animal then keeps eating, as seen in these two diagrams. And also, as you saw in one of the videos, this animal can then be treated by being given leptin injections. And there are a couple of rare genetic disorders in humans where they become morbidly obese, and they can be treated with leptin because their problem is an absolute leptin deficiency. So great amount of work has been going to understand leptin. And we now know that leptin doesn't act directly on either the lateral hypothalamus or the ventromedial hypothalamus, but it acts by focusing on another nucleus in the hypothalamus, the arcuate nucleus. Now, the arcuate nucleus has a couple of unique neurons, the neuropeptide Y neuron and the POMC neuron. What do these neurons do? Well, the neuropeptide Y neuron acts on the lateral hypothalamic area to create this sense of fullness, while the POMC area, it inhibits the lateral hypothalamic area. And therefore, sorry, I made a mistake there. Let me repeat it. The neuropeptide Y neuron, that acts on the lateral hypothalamic area, right, to promote feeding behavior. Because remember, the lateral hypothalamic area is important for feeding. The POMC actually inhibits that feeding area. So what does leptin do? Well, we now know that leptin inhibits neuropeptide Y neuron and promotes activity of the POMC neurons, ultimately then inhibiting feeding behavior. So let me just repeat that. Leptin, by inhibiting neuropeptide Y and activating the POMC neurons, is able to inhibit the feeding behavior seen within other parts of the hypothalamus. And so leptin, therefore, leads to a reduction in body weight. So then the question is, as you saw earlier, well, why do we become obese? Well, it does seem to be that something happens and we develop leptin resistance. Now, this idea of resistance to a hormone is not unusual because we also see this in type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, the problem is not that there's an absolute reduction in insulin as occurs in type 1. The problem is the cells become resistant to insulin. And this seems to be happening also in obesity. For some reason, the cells of the brain become resistant to leptin. And therefore, even though we're putting out the required amount of leptin, the brain and the body is not responding. We know this is the reason females tend to have a little bit more fat than men because they seem to be more leptin resistant when compared to males. Let's just look at this video here from the Society for Neuroscience as they talk about this a little bit.
Researchers are racing to figure out the causes of obesity, trying to curb an epidemic of growing waistlines. We've learned a lot in the past 40 years about obesity. It turns out it might just have as much to do with our brain as our gut. First, a bit how our brain and body work. Despite our iPhones, airplanes, and hot running water, humans have actually evolved very little as a species in the past few thousand years. Our bodies are wired just like they were in our prehistoric ancestors with one simple mission: don't starve. The human body is so devoted to fending off starvation that the mechanisms we've developed may actually be hurting us in an age where we don't really have to worry about catching our food. In fact, many of us have access to lots of foods, and it's the delicious high-calorie foods with lots of fat and sugar that can cause major problems. Neuroscientists have learned that fatty, sugary foods tap into the brain's pleasure centers, the same areas that are associated with heroin and cocaine habits. That's right. Sugary and fatty foods can be addictive, just like hard drugs. Research has shown that after extended periods of excessive eating, brain connections are permanently altered on a molecular level, making it harder to knock out obesity. Controlling body weight is a complicated process that's influenced by your genes, but it's not just genetic, and it's regulated by your brain. How do we know this? Mice. In the 1970s, researchers hypothesized that a chemical in the blood that travels to the brain triggered feelings of being hungry or full. So they studied mice that were naturally obese because of a rare genetic mutation. When the pleasantly plump mice were given blood from mice without the mutation, they suddenly started eating less and losing weight. Researchers figured the obese mice were missing a chemical that made them feel full. Fast forward 20 years. Researchers isolated the mutated gene that caused obesity in the mice. They were then able to identify a protein called leptin. Leptin is made in fat cells and triggers the feeling of satiety, or being full. In other words, more leptin means a decreased appetite. Miracle weight loss treatment, right? Not so much. It helped cure obesity in the genetically mutated mice because their bodies couldn't produce any functioning leptin. It also worked in children who had a very similar, very rare genetic mutation. Obese people who don't have this mutation actually have higher levels of leptin. This is because the body pumps out leptin to try to decrease appetite as weight increases. But the body develops a tolerance to this, so the leptin release becomes less and less effective. Obesity remains a very hot topic in scientific research, but there's still no one cure-all. The leptin discovery, however, had a major impact. It led scientists to discover a whole cocktail of chemicals in the body that regulate appetite, weight gain, weight loss. Some, like orexin, are made in a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. Others, like ghrelin and peptide tyrosine, hang out in your gut. All of these chemicals come together to affect your appetite. Genetics can also play a role. Mutations in your genes can cause changes to this cocktail of chemicals, which can affect your weight. But these mutations are rare, and your genes will have a much bigger role in determining your body type rather than how much you eat. Treating obesity requires a comprehensive approach. It's best to talk with your doctor to learn more about these issues if you or a loved one is seeking help. Your brain will thank you.
So that's a little summary on the state of obesity research and the role of leptin and the fact that leptin resistance does seem to be key in this obesity epidemic that we've mentioned. You would have heard there that the discovery of leptin would have led to major research to try and understand other hormones and other factors that affect body weight. And one of the others that is receiving a lot of attention is ghrelin. Now, ghrelin is not produced in the brain. Ghrelin is actually produced in the stomach and the pancreas. And ghrelin levels actually fall when you are hungry. So what does ghrelin do? Ghrelin actually stimulates you to eat by acting in the same arcuate nucleus and by stimulating neuropeptide Y production. So leptin inhibits neuropeptide Y. Ghrelin stimulates neuropeptide Y. And you can see here on this chart how the levels of ghrelin fluctuate throughout the day. And that once you eat, the levels of ghrelin fall. But as that food is removed from your system and the signals that are involved in the brain is removed, ghrelin levels start to rise again, stimulating one to eat. And so the take-home message here is simple. The regulation of body weight is very complex and includes multiple signals and involves brain biochemistry and neurochemistry. It's affected by many, many things, but in particular, our westernized diet and our sedentary behavior both affect the signaling in our brain and what we eat, and also our metabolic rate and how much energy we expend. Collectively, it seems that these things may have shifted the set point for those who are more genetically predisposed. And given our bodies always seek to defend our set point and to stop us from losing weight, once the set point has been elevated, it can be challenging to move it downwards. And so we saw the key role of the hypothalamus in regulating a homeostatic function that's not often considered one, that is body weight. Until next time, take care.